The gospel begins with a rather serious charge. This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them. On the surface, that seems about right. Even Pope Francis says, well, who am I? I'm a sinner. So we all think of ourselves as sinners, and we're the ones that come to the table. So that does seem like Jesus welcomes sinners and eats with them. It's helpful to know that this charge was brought by the Pharisees and the scribes, the religious elite. They're not exactly in Jesus' camp. In fact, Jesus' disciples have trouble enough figuring him out. Why would we accept this assertion from the opposition? But in fact, by making a judgment about others, the Pharisees are in fact making a judgment about themselves. This story is told from the perspective of the older brother. Remember? All these years I've worked for you like a slave. I never disobeyed your command. Of course, there are only 10 commandments. See how good he is? He's kept all the rules. But when this son of yours, hear it, not my brother, but this son of yours, the older brother separates himself. I don't eat with people like that. But Jesus does. Jesus goes out to anyone who is separated or cut off. And notice, the Father went out to each of his sons. Last week, convicted juvenile Carlos Adrian Vasquez Jr. received a letter from our Holy Father. At age 16, Vasquez began serving an 11-year sentence for involuntary manslaughter. And he wrote a letter to Pope Francis asking for forgiveness for what he had done. And to his surprise, the Holy Father wrote back, "Dear Carlos," the Pope wrote, "may the peace of Jesus Christ be with you. I was pleased to receive your recent letter. Know that the Holy Father is thinking of you and praying for you." Carlos was stunned. I couldn't believe it. I didn't think the Pope would write to someone who's behind bars. As St. Paul says in today's second reading, if anyone is in Christ, there is a new creation. In Christ, God is reconciling the world to himself. For our sake, God made Christ to be sin who knew no sin. So reconciliation is a hands-on project. You're not keeping a distance, but getting involved. Jesus is always crucified between two thieves. He takes his place with the outcasts. Notice on the cross, Jesus doesn't say, "Oh, don't confuse me with these guys. I'm innocent. I'm not a criminal." In fact, in Matthew 25, Jesus explicitly identifies with the outcasts. "I was hungry, and you gave me to eat. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me." We call these the 7 corporal works of mercy. Give drink to the thirsty, clothe the naked, shelter the homeless, visit the sick, visit the imprisoned, bury the dead. In Luke's Passion, Jesus prays, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing." And it's the good thief in Luke's Gospel who says, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus replies, "Truly I tell you, today you'll be with me in paradise." So on the cross, Jesus draws all people to himself. St. Paul in his letter to the Ephesians said, "But now in Christ Jesus, you who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ." Christ has broken down the dividing wall between us, that he might create in himself one new humanity in place of the two, thus making peace. James Allison says that according to this parable, the mercy of God is shown not to the group, but to the lost member, to the outsider. Allison asks us to consider quite how extraordinary this change of perception with respect to who God is turns out to be. Mercy has changed from something which covers up violence, casting people out, to something which unmasks it completely. For God, there are no outsiders, which means that any mechanism for the creation of outsiders is automatically and simply a mechanism of human violence, and that's that. This parable is not really so much about forgiveness as it is about mercy and reconciliation. As Paul said in the second reading today, God has given us the ministry of reconciliation, and we entreat you on behalf of Christ to be reconciled to God. But we cannot be reconciled to God unless we are also reconciled with our brother. As Walter Brueggemann says, you don't get God without the neighbors. The younger son does not ask forgiveness. He comes home because he's hungry and he wants to be fed. But the father, watching for him, waiting for him to come home, sees him while he's still a long way off. And filled with compassion, he ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Now what's interesting is that at this point in the story, the younger son disappears. So it's not this younger brother anymore, but every older brother and younger brother. Remember, some of you of a certain age, the Smothers Brothers? They had this wonderful shtick that they did. Mom always liked you best, which pretty much sums up the biblical story. There's always two sons, one older and one younger. Can you think of any? Cain and Abel, back in the very beginning. We don't know about whether mom or dad liked either best, although as Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor, said, where were the parents? Abel's sacrifice pleased God and Cain's was rejected, so Cain killed his brother Abel. But we do know more the story of Isaac and Ishmael. Ishmael, of course, was the firstborn by Sarah's slave, Hagar. But once Isaac was born, Sarah definitely loved him more. And so for the sake of peace in the house, Abraham was all too willing to banish Ishmael, the elder, from the house. Now Isaac had twin sons, Jacob and Esau. But Esau was the elder brother. But Rebekah, his mother, loved Jacob more. The name Jacob means heel grabber, but it was not just Esau's heel that he grabbed. Jacob also grabbed hold of his older brother's inheritance. Now Jacob had 12 sons, but the youngest, Joseph, was by far his favorite. His 11 brothers actually intended to kill Joseph, but then Reuben intervened, and thank God or coincidence, some Midianites came by and they sold him off for 20 pieces of silver, and he went down to Egypt. But that's another story. Let's go back to Jacob and Esau. When Isaac was an old man, he couldn't see anymore, and he was getting ready to die, and he called in his elder son, Esau. He said, go out and hunt, kill a game, and prepare a meal for me, and then I will give you my blessing. I'll give you your inheritance. Well, Rebekah heard this, and she favored Jacob, so she said, go out in the yard, kill a goat. You take the skin of the goat, put it on your arms, because your brother Esau is hairy and you are smooth. The old man can't see anyway. I'll fix dinner. You go in and get the blessing. Esau, of course, arrived to discover that his younger brother had just stolen his inheritance. So you can imagine how that went. There really wasn't room in the land of Canaan for the both of them. They lived at opposite ends of the land. But over the years, Jacob really wanted to be reconciled with his brother. But how could he? He stole his older brother's inheritance. But he sent gifts. And finally, he decided he had to go. And so he comes and camps outside of Esau's home. And the night before, he can't sleep. And he gets up in the night. And someone wrestles with him. The text is unclear. It could be God. It might be an angel. It even says it's a man. Maybe he wrestled with Esau. Whatever it was, whoever it was, in the night, these things can't be settled. But they wrestled all night long. And in the morning, the adversary said, let me go. It's going to be daylight and you cannot see my face. Jacob would not let him go until he blessed him. So he said, I bless you. I give you a new name. You'll be called Israel, because you have wrestled with God and have prevailed. And so in the morning, Jacob went and walked toward his brother's house. And you know what happened. But Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. This is exactly the same line in today's gospel. When the father runs out, filled with compassion, he ran to his son, embraced him, and kissed him. So Jesus is doing a mime. He's quoting Genesis 33 to the elder brothers, to the Pharisees. They know it's not the father who ran to welcome the younger brother. It's the older brother in the story who's supposed to go and be reconciled with the younger brother who stole his inheritance. That's what mercy looks like. That's how reconciliation happens. And then Jacob said, if I have found favor with you, for truly to see your face is like seeing the face of God. All night long when he wrestled with God or an angel, he couldn't see his face. Only when he reconciled with his brother could he finally see the face of God. Our faith is like that as well. Biblical faith offers no God who is not embedded in the fabric of human interactions. So estranged brotherliness leads to estrangement from God, and reconciled brotherliness leads to reconciliation with God. The Eucharist, of course, is the meal of reconciliation. In Matthew 5, Jesus said, so when you are offering your gift at the altar, and if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar. Go first and be reconciled with your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Jesus invites us to this meal of mercy and reconciliation. But only those who are reconciled and in communion with each other come to the table. Jesus does not eat with sinners, but rather with reconciled and forgiven daughters and sons. But only when we remember who we are, like the younger son who came home to himself, do we accept the invitation to come home.